Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw wavy fur in graphite. Now the techniques that I share here can also be applied when drawing more curlier fur textures. Now the first thing that I like to do with any of my portraits is to get some kind of graphite on the surface first. Now my preference to do that is using graphite powder. Now as you can see here, all I'm doing is mapping in my main lights and darks. Now I'm not overly worried about getting every single light and dark shade in, but I do want to hint at the main places where the darkest values are and my lightest values are. Now what this does is, although we can make changes to these as we go, if I map them in accurately first, I can then look at my reference photo, back at my artwork, and I know exactly where I should be working. When drawing the curlier or more wavy fur, it can be very easy to get lost in exactly where we should be drawing, so mapping in these lights and darks first can make a huge difference. Now in terms of getting the contrast right, this is something that I talk about in all tutorials. The contrast, the values, it's all about your lights and your darks, but also the all crucial midtones in between. Now in order to build up maximum depth here, I need to be focusing on individual layers and reinforcing the contrast as I go. I've got a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in graphite. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But one of the things that I talk about there is pencil technique. Now although I'm not using my pencils yet, the techniques would be the same. I'm following three structures, so that's the fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. Now the fur thickness here is not quite so much of an importance, but I do want to be making sure that the way that I'm moving this applicator is following the direction of the fur. Now again, I don't have to go for completely accurate there. If this dog was to shake its head, the curls and the wavy fur would look slightly different, so I do just want to go for close. But I am making sure to move that applicator at that base layer stage to hint at all of that change of direction. Now again, this is something that I can change as I go, but if I have that in the initial layer, then I'm able to then follow that more closely as I start to now work with my graphite pencils. Now because there's a lot going on with wavy or curly fur, we can sometimes look at that reference photo and think, I'm not really sure what section of fur I should be drawing first. Now I think this is a real normal feeling to have, especially when you're working on a complex fur texture like this. So what I like to do in that situation is break it up into more smaller sections, even if it's just 1 square inch at a time, and then add additional layers. You want to break that up into more layers so that you can simplify the process. Now again, this is something that I speak about in the real-time version on Patreon, and this was recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so everything was explained thoroughly in the moment, and I think with a complex fur texture like this, that can really help to simplify the process further. So now that I'm working with more of my graphite pencils, the pencil technique here is becoming more obvious. So now I'm going to start to do the same techniques but using an eraser. So again, I'm focusing on the fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. Now the eraser that I'm using here is my Tombow Mono Eraser, and I love it for this kind of highlight. I have the control that I need, it removes the graphite, but the key thing with this eraser is that the graphite is applied correctly. Now again, this is something that I focus on every single one of my real-time tutorials on Patreon. The only way that these erasers can work in the way that they are meant and remove as much graphite as possible is if the graphite is applied correctly in the first place. So I do want to be making sure that although I'm using the erasers, that the graphite is applied in a way that enables those erasers to work to the best of their ability. However, just like when working with the pencils, it's important to adjust how we use those erasers depending on the type of effect that we're trying to create. So if you don't want a particularly bright highlight, you're going to have to adjust how to use that eraser. So if that is something that you would like to see more in depth, then I'll link my Patreon channel for this tutorial in the description below. So what I'm now going to do is come back in with some of my darker graphite pencils and reinforce my contrast. Now again, this is something that I've spoken about at the beginning of the tutorial, and as always I'm going to be coming through and making sure that I've got that right at all stages. So one question that I'm asked with my colour-based mediums such as pastels and acrylics is, how do you know which colour to select? Now this really is something that causes a lot of anxiety, but the colour of a portrait is not what's going to make it look realistic. If that really was the case, then graphite wouldn't be realistic either, because there is no colour here. It's the values, the lights and the darks that builds up that three-dimensional shape. So I want to be making sure that I've got those highlights bright, that I've got my shadows dark, but that I've got those subtle midtones as well. So I always want to be making sure that no matter what it is, however many details I've put in my drawing, if I don't have my contrast right, that artwork will look flat. So it's all about getting a balance between each of these factors. So once I've got the area on the left there that I've just been working on about 90% complete, it's pretty much done, I'm going to move on to the next section. Now again, this is a rinse and repeat process where I'm mapping in my main shapes and I'm focusing on the fur direction. Now the one thing that I want to mention here is, as I've said, that section above there that we've been working on is not completely finished. I'm going to add the real final details, those top highlights at the end. And that is important because they are resting on the top section of the fur. If you were to stroke this dog, that would be the section of fur that you would come into contact with first. So I want to be leaving those for the very last layer, just like I would with any whiskers. Now I often speak about how the fur direction isn't random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. But when you're working on longer fur like this that is wavy or has that curlier nature, that has a little bit more freedom of movement. Now of course that movement is going to become more exaggerated when that fur gets longer. So this section that I'm currently working on here, all of my pencil strokes are starting to become significantly longer than the area at the top on the area that we started with first. So I want to be making sure that I have really captured that change because that's also going to help to build up more of the realism. Now as well as that, look at how the curls or the wavier sections of fur are overlapping at many different points. Don't be scared to overlap those details because this is going to help to make that fur not, you don't want it to look messy unnecessarily, but obviously here we can't really isolate one specific individual hair. That section of fur would be clumped together, so I want to be making sure that I have indicated at that, and usually when you get that sort of fur texture, it overlaps in many different situations. Now the techniques that I'm showing here would be exactly the same if I was drawing a spaniel ear. I get a lot of questions about that fur type as well, but all of the same tools, the erasers, the layering process, it would be for me exactly the same process. Now one thing that I think can happen very easily with this specific fur texture is we have a tendency to overwork it. So in some cases, especially if we're not quite sure how we should be approaching that fur type, we can add some pencil strokes, we can then try to remove it, add some more, and then we get really confused and then we start getting a bit lost on which layer we should be drawing first. Now if you do find that that's happening, I would really just recommend to maybe work on another section of the portrait, put it away for a little while, even if it's just half an hour, and then look at it again with fresh eyes. One of the worst things I think we can do, and we are all a little bit guilty of this I think, is sort of carrying on with the drawing when we're not quite in that moment, in the zone, and then we can start making wrong decisions, which actually then ends up in mistakes being made, and although they can be fixed, usually most of the time, it then adds additional time to that drawing and more stress. So if you do feel like that at any point, I always just think it's worth, even for half an hour, just pulling it away, maybe walk the dog, have a coffee, something like that, and then start again with that one section that you were finding a little bit more challenging. Now one huge tip here, when you're working on the fur that overlaps the background, make sure that they are also random. You want to have a nice variety with how they are curling and curving so that they don't have that straight edge and harsh edge appearance. Otherwise the subject on that white paper can end up looking like a sticker that's just been cut out and stuck on. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, that would be a huge help to my channel. It really does make a difference. And I also upload a couple of videos here to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to see the real-time version of this tutorial or any of my in-depth tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. The wonderful thing about Patreon is it's very flexible. You can stay for as long as you want or you can cancel at any time. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And as always, thank you so much for watching.